For most of us, airports are the kick-off point for our eagerly anticipated holidays abroad, or perhaps less eagerly anticipated business trips, filled with passengers and staff alike toing and froing in the busy terminals. And Heathrow Airport is no different, being one of the busiest airports in the world. It's a hub for connecting you with far-off countries, and a hive of constant activity, noise and movement. And with millions of passengers travelling through Heathrow's doors each year, it's easy to overlook the ordinary, like that sharply dressed, if a little old-fashioned gentleman sitting in the VIP lounge. Surely there's nothing more to him than meets the eye. Or maybe it's just your jet lag making you hear things, or perhaps you really did overhear staff whispering about mysterious figures seen on the runway. Before it became the huge international travel hub that it is today, Heathrow Airport started out as a small private airfield. It was built on what was known as Hounslow Heath, which used to be used as common land. And just as a side note that may or may not be important later on, highwaymen were very fond of this area in the 17th and 18th centuries. But by 1925, the majority of the land in the area was used for farming, with orchards and fields of wheat crops and things like that. But in that same year, an RAF officer called Norman Macmillan was working as a test pilot when he was forced to land and then take off in this area. And what really stuck out to him was how flat this piece of land was, how it was kind of in a good spot to put an airfield in. But it wasn't until 1928, when Norman had started working for Fairey Aviation, an aircraft manufacturer, when they were on the lookout for a new aerodrome where they could test their planes. And remembering his experience in 1925, he recommended that Hounslow Heath patch of land, just southeast of a little hamlet called Heathrow. Surveys were done. Yep, this looks good. So Fairey Aviation started buying some of the land in the area. And by June 1930, the new airfield was ready to go. Initially, it was called the Harmondsworth Aerodrome, but then changing to the Great West Aerodrome, but sometimes just being referred to as the Heathrow Aerodrome. And so Richard Fairey, the owner of Fairey Aviation, he had big plans for the place. They were going to make this their base of operations, moving all manufacturing here to this airfield in Heathrow. But then World War II happened, and more specifically, 1944, so actually coming to the concluding years of the war. But there was actually a bit of drama around what happened here, because basically during the war the RAF had used the airfield when they needed to, but it had never had an actual squadron based there. But the British Air Ministry, they had their eye on Heathrow, and so they claimed that they needed to requisition this airfield for military use. We need it to help us win the war, we need something exactly like this for our long-range military aircraft. Thing was, the British Air Ministry was super shady with this, and it actually all came out in 1973 in Harold Balfour's autobiography called Wings Over Westminster, because he was the Under-Secretary of State for Air at the time. But basically what happened was the Air Ministry was claiming that it was for military use, one last push for the war. That's what they even told Parliament and the Prime Minister at the time, Winston Churchill. They had no idea of the actual intentions, because in reality the British Air Ministry had no interest in the military side of things. They were thinking longer term. They had their sights set on making this a civilian airport after the war. So why bother with all the smoke and mirrors? Surely the wider government would be fine with trying to help the country's economy to get going again after the war with this civilian airport, right? Well, by saying that the airfield would be for military use in aid of the war effort, they could basically get away with not paying landowners fairly, as well as bypass all the red tape, the public inquiries, and the fairly complex, lengthy procedures that they would have to do if they'd been upfront about it. Because it's an emergency wartime thing, we need it now. Public opinion and landowners in the way be damned. So during 1944, the airfield was expanded, 1,300 acres was requisitioned, and Heathrow Farm, Heathrow House and Heathrow Hall were amongst the many buildings and farms demolished to make way for progress. Obviously, the Second World War ended the year after all of this had kicked off in 1945, and so they were a bit like, well, we've put all this work into developing the site, ... May as well turn it into a civilian airport now. So unbelievably shady. So in 1946, the Air Ministry transferred ownership of the site to the Ministry of Civil Aviation, and the airport was officially opened as London Airport to civilian passengers. Over the years, obviously the airport grew as the world got smaller, aviation got more sophisticated with bigger and faster planes, and in 1966 the name was officially changed to London Heathrow Airport to differentiate it from other airports in the London area. And today it's still one of the busiest international airports in the world, with over 79 million passengers flying from the airport to the furthest corners of the world world in 2023 on over 90 different airlines. So that all sounds very grand, doesn't it? And very busy. There's a lot of people, both passengers, airline staff, and actual airport staff. And so it's no surprise that for some, it's actually quite a dangerous place. Both passengers and staff have passed away at Heathrow from natural causes over the years, and some airport employees have unfortunately lost their lives in workplace accidents, with one as recently as February 2022 when a worker was crushed as he was unloading baggage from an aircraft. But then of course, you've got the air disasters. On the 31st of October 1950, a BEA Vickers Viking crashed into the runway after trying to land in heavy fog. This resulted in the deaths of 3 crew members and 25 passengers, with only 1 stewardess and 1 passenger who had both been seated near the tail of the plane surviving. 6 years later, on the 1st of October 1956, an RAF Avro Vulcan bomber was being delivered, but again was attempting to land in bad weather. The pilot thought he was higher than he was, but hit the ground in front of the runway. He and the co-pilot ejected, but the 4 other passengers weren't able to, so they were killed. On the 27th of October 1965, a BEA Vickers Vanguard was, yet again, trying to land in poor weather. All 30 passengers and 6 crew members died in that crash. And then on the 8th of April 1968, a Boeing 707-465, Flight 712, was on its way to Australia via Singapore, when it suffered an engine fire just after takeoff. The plane had managed to do an emergency landing, but as soon as it hit the ground, it burst into flames. 4 passengers and a flight attendant died, while 122 managed to survive, which is miraculous that the death toll wasn't higher, really. Later on that year, on the 3rd of July 1968, an airspeed ambassador collided with 2 parked planes. And this was after the pilot had lost control of the wing lift, meaning that the plane kind of just was able to roll to one side, not what you want your plane to do while you're trying to take off. This plane had actually been converted into basically an airborne horse box, and it was carrying 8 racehorses at the time of the crash. All of the flight crew and 3 of the 5 grooms died in the crash, along with all 8 horses. One of the 2 Hawker Siddeley Trident planes that the ambassador had crashed into was written off, but the other one, Trident GARPI, was actually repaired and returned to service, only to be lost in one of the deadliest air disasters on British soil, when Flight 548 stalled a couple of minutes after takeoff and crashed to the ground, killing all 112 passengers and 6 cabin crew. So with these air disasters, you can just see the scale of death that has actually happened at Heathrow. Like, there is a lot of people that have lost their lives in this area. And there is one more crash that I need to mention, because it is now potentially the cause of what I would say is probably the most famous ghost story now connected to Heathrow Airport. And it was actually the first fatal crash at Heathrow, because on the 2nd of March 1948, a Douglas DC-3 operated by a Belgian airline called Sabina was attempting to land on runway 28R10L. And if you look at a map of Heathrow now, there isn't a 28R runway there anymore. Apparently, according to Air Britain, the names were changed in 1987, but from what I could tell, it would have been pretty much the same as the runway that's there now, 27R09L. The only clue I found was from one of the newspaper articles saying that it was lucky the plane didn't crash 300 yards away, as otherwise then it would have landed on houses on Bath Road. So I just kind of put 2 and 2 together, a bit of amateur sleuthing, so I could be wrong on the exact runway, and if I am wrong, please do let me know. But this disaster, just like the others that have happened at Heathrow over the years, it was bad weather. There was super thick fog, but the crew had radioed ahead and already told air traffic control to have ambulances at the ready. We might be making an emergency landing. So they might have already been in trouble before the fog. At about 9:15 in the evening, the plane nosedived onto the grass near to the runway and burst into flames. Workers who were in one of the hangars nearby obviously saw all of this happen, so they were immediately able to rush over and try to help anyone they could. They reported that they could hear the screams from passengers who were trapped inside the wreckage, as apparently some couldn't get their seatbelts undone. But these 2 workers, Harold Bending and Angus Brown, they went into the burning aircraft and dragged 3 people away to safety. But before long, the heat was too intense, and unfortunately the screams grew quiet. That night, 3 crew members and 17 passengers died, as one of the people pulled from the wreckage died later of his injuries, meaning that of the 22 flying in that aircraft, 20 didn't make it. An hour after the plane had crashed, when rescue workers were standing knee-deep in foam and mud, they allegedly had a potential paranormal encounter. They were there, sifting through the wreckage using only the headlights of ambulances and fire engines, when a man emerged from the thick fog. They said he was quite tall, wearing twill cavalry trousers and a black bowler hat. He approached the rescue workers and kind of got their attention and just asked them, "Don't suppose you've seen my briefcase, have you?" Obviously, they're all a little preoccupied trying to find any survivors if by some miracle they've survived this long. And so they just assumed that he must have been one of the survivors who was dragged from the plane at the start. But my friend, your briefcase is not the priority right now. You should just be thankful you're alive, you know what I mean? But without questioning it, they just said, "Don't worry about it, we will obviously save everything we can. Once the recovery work is done, go and speak to the airport officials to see if we salvage your briefcase." The man seemed fairly satisfied with this answer, so he walked away and disappeared back into the fog. A while later, the rescue workers came across that same man again, only they were looking at his badly burned body, trapped within the wreckage of the plane. Obviously, that is a very unnerving situation to find yourself in, although the story doesn't mention if they ever actually did find his briefcase. I'm gonna guess not, it probably burned up in the fire. But after this though, more people started to report this apparition of a man wearing a bowler hat, wandering on the runway where the plane crashed. There's one story that took place in 1970 where the control tower radioed down to the airport police to say that they could see a man walking on the runway. But from what I can tell from other people who have mentioned this before, I don't think a single human person would make a big enough signal to be picked up on radar. So not sure about that detail. Maybe they just saw him from the tower. Maybe it was a huge form big enough to create a radar signal. But when they looked out, it was a man. I don't really know. But this is just the story as it stands anyway. Inspector Leslie Alton, who had been working at Heathrow for 20 years by that point, he took the call from the control tower. So he got his team together and they drove out to the runway to see if they could find this person who most definitely shouldn't be on the runway. But when they got to the spot where the control tower had told them, there was nothing there. They were kind of going back and forth with the staff at the control tower like, okay, there's no one here. But staff in the tower were adamant, we can see this figure is literally right next to you. But there was nothing there. The control tower then came back and said to Leslie, look, there's no way that you just didn't notice him then because he's now behind you. Did you run him over? Leslie and the team on the runway are just bewildered at this point. They haven't seen a single thing. Until eventually, the story says that this figure just disappeared off the radar. Again, singular humans apparently don't show up on radar, but this is just the story. Allegedly though, that wasn't the only time that this figure has been spotted. Sometime, again in the 1970s, a very similar story, a police officer had been called out to that same runway to find a person who had been reported. This time though, when the police officer got there, they actually saw this man, completely solid, flesh and blood, wearing his bowler hat. He apparently looked very confused, and when the police officer questioned him like, what are you doing? You can't be out here on the runway. He responded, saying he was looking for his briefcase. When the officer got out of the patrol car to approach him though, the man disappeared in front of his eyes. And so it's not just the control tower who sees this figure. And in 2014, a member of staff who had worked for British Airways for like 30 years, they told the BBC that there have been at least 7 reported sightings of this man on the runway, and those are just the ones that he knows about. Apparently pilots will be bringing their planes into land or be taxiing towards the runway when they'll radio to air traffic control, saying that they've seen a man wearing a bowler hat, carrying an umbrella and a briefcase. So in these stories, he's been reunited with his briefcase. But they'll say, you need to get emergency services out there immediately because we have 100% just ran that person over. The control tower will say they've not picked up anything, but they'll send the marshals out. Only to find there is nothing there at all, no trace of a person whatsoever. But it's not just the runways that have stories connected to them. Apparently Heathrow itself is haunted by the ghost of a young boy. And right here, I just need to shout about the YouTube channel Ghost Casebook. She does absolutely brilliant haunted history, and she's a lovely person too, so go check out Nicola if you don't know her. Because I first came across this particular story in her YouTube video on haunted airports, which I'll leave a link to in my description. And the thing about this Terminal 3 story is that it is absolutely nowhere online. The only place it is recorded is in Lee Brickley's book called Haunted Airports. And we've just come off the back of the saga of Cannock Chase, where again, a lot of the entities and enigmas have found themselves in the spotlight because of Lee Brickley's books. If you've watched my Cannock Chase videos, you'll see that there are a lot of these creatures allegedly haunting the chase. And so purely based on the fact that this story comes from only one source, and I couldn't find anywhere else to validate this story, it's not to say that it isn't true, but gets that grain of salt at the ready, you know? But anyway, all that aside, the story goes that a figure of a young boy, about 6-ish years old, sometimes manifests within the airport terminals. Most often at Terminal 3, but he has been seen elsewhere, in different departure lounges, baggage claims, or even sometimes out on the runway. He's seen clutching a battered, beaten up suitcase, and he's always crying his eyes out. He is so upset. This little boy was first encountered in 1970 by construction workers who were building the extension of Terminal 3, and apparently they they would often hear a little kid crying. And this sound was so lifelike that the only conclusion that they could come to was that there was a lost child or something. So they would actually go and try and find him, but they'd never find anyone. They'd just hear these kids' cries echoing in the empty corridors. Once the terminal was back up and running though, both passengers and airport staff would sometimes report hearing these same cries again, which during the day would be easy to dismiss as an upset young traveller waiting for a flight, like wouldn't be a big deal. But in the dead of night or very early morning, which is when these cries would most often be heard, again, it's not beyond the realms of imagination for it to be a living child, but it's a little harder to dismiss, isn't it? Especially when you can't find the kid but you can hear the cries loud and clear. But then you could have an altogether more unnerving experience, just like the encounter one woman had while she was waiting for a connecting flight. She was just sat there, it was the early hours of the morning, when she heard this child's crying. And the way this kid sounded, he clearly didn't have a responsible adult around him to comfort him, so this woman went off to try and find the crying child, as so many had done before when they'd heard him. Only this time, she actually found him. Was it because she was a female passenger on her own? He thought it was quote-unquote safe enough to manifest in front of her? Just interesting to think about why. This woman described the boy as pretty much clearly a ghost, or a kid who looks like he's just seen a ghost. He had a very pale, almost translucent face, and his eyes were hollow and just full of sadness. So this woman, she's seen this distraught 6-year-old boy in front of her, crying his eyes out, so she reaches towards him to try and comfort him, but he vanishes right in front of her eyes. So she was pretty shaken up after that experience at 3 in the morning. Not something you want to encounter on your own when all you're doing is waiting for a connecting flight, you know? Maybe just put your noise cancelling earphones in next time, I don't know. We don't know for sure who this apparition actually is. Psychics and paranormal investigators have attempted to make contact over the years and have apparently learned that his name is Thomas and that he was flying with his family when the plane he was on crashed. Because he couldn't find his parents in the ensuing chaos, he is now stuck wandering the airport, lost and confused. There is a theory about which plane Thomas was on, but the book gets a little sketchy with the details here because it says that he was on a plane that crashed at Heathrow in the early 1960s and over 100 passengers lost their lives. But there were 2 crashes in the 60s, one in 65 where 36 people lost their lives and one in 68 where 5 people died. There was the Staines disaster which happened in the early 70s where yes, 118 people died. But without passenger manifests to see which plane had children around 6-ish years of age and then without the names to try and track down this Thomas, it's more than likely that we're never going to really know who this alleged entity actually is. But that's not to say that there isn't something there. Passengers who have absolutely no knowledge of the paranormal stories of Heathrow, which, let's be honest, is probably a lot of them, airports aren't really the first place you'd think of as being haunted. Although as a side note, turns out they're apparently super haunted. Who knew? But anyway, sometimes passengers and staff will feel a tugging at their clothes, or they might be poked, just as if a child is trying to get their attention. Even though when they look around expecting to see a lost child needing help, there's never anything there. But even if you pay extra to wait for your flight in the luxury of the VIP lounge, you're still apparently not safe from a potentially paranormal experience. Because back on the 6th of July 1980, the Sunday People newspaper wrote about the ghost in a light grey suit, who had apparently been spotted multiple times in the VIP lounge of Terminal 1. And there have been a few witnesses to this mysterious, if very sharply dressed gentleman over the years. The first one came from a diplomat from a high commission in London, and he was there, chilling out in the VIP lounge. All of a sudden, he is tearing it out of the lounge and running to airport staff to tell them what he has just witnessed. And what was it that terrified him so much? He saw a man in grey suit trousers standing directly in front of him. Okay, unless you've got major personal space issues, doesn't sound super weird yet, right? Until you learn that this figure of the man in the grey trousers was only visible from the waist down. One of the staff members that was talking down this diplomat after his encounter, a catering officer called Claire Baker, she said that she actually also has seen this apparition. And by the way she says it, it sounds like she has seen the manifestation of the entire figure. Because she said that when she saw this man in the grey suit, she looked at him, seemed flesh and blood, okay, fine, it's another passenger, looked away. But when she looked again, the man had disappeared. But there was no way that an actual real living man would have been able to walk out of the room, as he would have had to go past her, and she most definitely would have noticed. But she also said that she wasn't scared. The entity seemed fairly benign, even going so far as to being perfectly friendly. But I still don't hold it against the diplomat really. Seeing half of a ghost is probably just as scary, if not worse, than seeing the whole thing. At least if you see a full flesh and blood apparition, you could comfort yourself in thinking that it's probably just another human, right? But when you're just seeing ghosts ghostly legs standing directly in front of you, there's kind of no getting away from the fact that you're either hallucinating, which again could be disconcerting, or you're currently in the company of something potentially paranormal. This account was quite compelling though. It came from a police officer who worked at Heathrow, Ellie Harris. She claimed that in that VIP lounge in Terminal 1, she felt like there was a presence in the room with her. She most definitely had that gut feeling that she wasn't alone. And Ellie, she says that she's a skeptic, so not one to really rush to thinking straight up it's a ghost, but she just said that that overwhelming, undeniable feeling of having that presence, she couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation for it. And Terminal 1 was actually closed to passengers after the final departure on the 29th of June 2015 to make way for the expansion of Terminal 2. So obviously that VIP lounge isn't actually in use anymore. And while Terminal 1 is still used in some capacity for Terminal 2's baggage handling, the rest of the building pretty much stands there empty. There were plans to demolish the building to make way for an expansion on Terminal 2, but there's nothing really set in stone. So it would be interesting to hear from any baggage handlers who still work out of Terminal 1 if they've had any run-ins with this man in the light grey suit, now that the terminal pretty much stands empty at all hours. And maybe if they ever do decide to demolish the building, will that mean the end of this particular entity, or will he start showing up somewhere else? And while we know pretty much nothing about this particular ghostly businessman, there is one alleged apparition who is pretty much an A-lister around the country at this point. Because, believe it or not, I couldn't believe it when I saw this name pop up yet again. The ghost of Dick Turpin is claimed to haunt Heathrow Airport. I know. I know. Yep, that Dick Turpin, the 18th century highwayman who was infamous up and down the country, but who liked to operate around the roads going in and out of London. And what used to just be a remote road on lawless heathland going in and out of London before someone slapped an airport there centuries later? That's right, Hounslow Heath. Highwayman heaven. And so now, apparently, pilots, ground staff, and even sometimes airport police officers have witnessed a figure walking on the runways. And this figure is distinguished from being the famous man in the bowler hat, as this one appears to be wearing a tricorn hat and a cloak. Witnesses claim that he does venture inside the airport on occasion. As staff have reported hearing the sounds of a man barking or howling right behind them, but when they turn round, there's no one there. I don't know, maybe there's weird echoes going through the building, they're just hearing a slightly jet-lagged passenger from quite far away. But the problem is, sometimes airline employees have also reported that they'll feel rank, hot breath on their necks, which will of course make them spin round, and again, no one is there. Which, that one is a little harder to explain away. And this figure in the tricorn hat, thought to be Dick Turpin himself, has also apparently been seen in the corridors, trying to affect the living in any way he can, from screaming out loud to whispering unintelligible things in people's ears. But apparently he's also thought to be responsible for the absolutely terrifying encounter that a ticket agent had in Heathrow back in 2002, where she was all of a sudden thrown to the floor and then pulled across the terminal by her hair by something unseen. And this was allegedly witnessed by multiple people who watched this poor woman be dragged by some invisible force. But being dragged across the floor by your hair, that's got to be painful. And then by something you can't even see. I cannot imagine the trauma that would cause, honestly. I would find it very hard to get ready for work in the mornings if that was me. And could it also be Dick Turpin responsible for terrorising the cleaning crews who go onto planes after the passengers have disembarked? Or is that something else entirely? Because it was actually reported on the 22nd of October 1974 in the newspaper The Evening News that some cleaners point blank refused to get on planes on their own. Which, as I was thinking about it, if you really are the only person on a plane, paranormal or not, it's kind of going to be a bit of an eerie place to find yourself. That space that's set up for hundreds of people and you're all alone. I don't know, maybe that's just me, but just simply being in that situation would have me somewhat on edge anyway. But what these cleaners experience is apparently much worse than just your mind running away with you, because they claim to experience an utterly evil presence that they never saw with their eyes, but that would apparently try to pick them up and throw them across the plane. Other cleaners who came into contact with this presence would find themselves completely paralysed, just unable to move until whatever it was decided to let them go. With one guy called Mr. Parson Lal Palmer, the night foreman for a cleaning company, he'd just sat down for a bit of a rest before getting going again, when he found himself completely unable to move. He could not get up out of his chair. Perhaps even more horrifying was that whatever it was that was stopping him from standing up was also holding his eyes shut, so he couldn't open them, he couldn't see a thing. Unable to move and blinded. Absolutely no. No thank you, that would be my one and only reason cited on my resignation letter. He said that it was at least 4 or 5 minutes before he was able to move, which may have been an exaggeration as to how long it felt felt being so terrified and it was really just a few seconds, or it might have actually been the case and in reality he probably felt like he was there for hours, which doesn't really bear thinking about. Absolutely terrifying. He went on to say where he suspected that this activity started. As before, they'd never had an issue with this until one day when they opened the doors on what I assume was one of the planes that they would be cleaning, and all it was that there was a strange smell, which, I mean, doesn't really sound like much when you say it like that. Planes are self-contained pressurized canisters. It would probably take one accident from a passenger or gone off food or anything like that to cause a quote-unquote strange smell. There are 1,000,001 reasonable explanations for that. But Parson Lau Palmer went on to say that this strange smell, they never got to the bottom of what it actually was, and it even disappeared for a while, but then it inexplicably came back later. But that's the only information I could get on his account of the whole thing. It is certainly very interesting that he was able to pinpoint the origin of this supposed evil presence, so it must have really shaken up some of the cleaning staff for them to refuse to work alone. I don't know if it was specific planes where this happened or if it just happened randomly, but even so, that would be enough to make me never want to find myself alone on a plane at Heathrow late at night. And so while those are the main stories associated with Heathrow Airport with somewhat corroborated information, apart from the boy in Terminal 3, they aren't the only reports that staff members have claimed. Perimeter security have sometimes noticed someone walking past their office window at night, which is a very odd thing as no one should be out there. When they go to see who it was, there's no one there. And a flight attendant wearing a uniform that looked to be from around the 70s has also been spotted around the airport before disappearing into thin air. And while I was doing the research for this one, I came across a story, and as far as I can tell, it's not a ghost story. This person doesn't haunt the airport, but it's all to do with one member of the Sex Pistols, Sid Vicious. And it's very much an urban myth. It's a rumour on the testimony of Johnny Rotten himself, so take from that what you will. But basically, what happened was in February 1979, Sid was found dead of a drug overdose just months after the murder of his girlfriend, Nancy Spungen, a murder which Sid was actually the suspect in. Sid Vicious was cremated, and the official line was that his ashes were scattered over Nancy's grave. But Johnny Rotten claims that that's not what happened. Sid's mum, Anne Beverly, she wanted to fly her son's ashes back from New York City to the UK, and so she boarded a plane from JFK to Heathrow with the urn as hand luggage. Thing was, allegedly, Anne had hidden her own personal stash of heroin in Sid's urn, because in her mind, who's going to check the urn being brought through by a grieving mother? But apparently, once she got to Heathrow, she started to get nervous. There were a lot more security than she was expecting, and so she found the nearest air conditioning vent and dumped the ashes of her son and the heroin down this vent at Heathrow Airport. And so now Johnny Rotten claims that his ex-bandmate is floating around the air conditioning system of Heathrow. But like I say, no evidence to suggest that this is true. It is just a wild story that I had to include here. But the next time that you arrive at Heathrow Departures Lounge for your next getaway to an exotic location, just take a look around you at the other passengers because they might not be boarding a plane with you. And definitely keep an eye out on the runway to see if you can spot the briefcase that has eluded the ghostly man in the bowler hat for decades. So what do you think? When I first started the research for this one, I was there thinking, there is no way that this is going to be a long video. There's a couple of ghost stories, okay, it'll be fine. I always end up doing that though. I always think, oh, yeah, there isn't going to be a lot to this one, and then boom, I'm talking for ages. But anyway, Heathrow Airport. I would 100% say it is haunted, even if by some residual energy. It's not the oldest airport in the world, but it's got a lot of history. There have been, unfortunately, a lot of deaths by plane crashes over the years. And then the sheer amount of people passing through here, excited to go on holiday, or having to travel home for a family emergency, or moving to a different country to start a new life. That's a lot of people bringing a lot of different energy to the building. To me, it just makes sense. But let me know your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this video, let me know by leaving it a little like. And it would be super cool if you're not already to subscribe to my channel too, if you like this sort of stuff. But anyway, that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. 1,300 acres were requisitioned. I'm good.